Right, greetings, hello, welcome back for part 2 of our philosophy club, and it's Christmas Eve, which is a good time to be sharing about religious knowledge. For many people around the world this is a very sacred time, and really what it represents is that birth of Christ, but the importance of that is the birth of the divine consciousness into humanity. That's what official Christianity explains it as. But the people we're looking at today would say, well, that's great, but what we should be doing is finding out how to birth that divine consciousness in us. What techniques, practices, and so on. And that's what these new religions are trying to grapple with. The next one we're going to look at is a very interesting one. It's called 105, box 105. It's called Cosmism and Ufology. Now, this, in a nutshell, is a new religious movement, effectively, from about the very early 1900s, perhaps the end of the 19th century, 1880s, 90s, which really rises with the growth of science, and particularly astronomy. Up until fairly recently, the sheer size and scale of the universe wasn't understood. Obviously, in the time before Copernicus, most religions and religious thinkers thought this Earth was the centre of the universe. It's the cats, don't worry, they're playing, they're singing Christmas songs. So this Earth was the centre of the universe, and then the Sun and all the other planets go round us, but we're fixed in the middle. After Copernicus, it no longer was possible to think like that, and it was realised that the Sun is the centre of the solar system, and then all the planets, including Earth, rotate around it. And that was a bit of a shock, because it meant the Earth was no longer like the centre of everything. So there was a bit of a shift in thinking at that point. But most people still thought the kind of universe you can see with the stars isn't that big. And so they dreamed of maybe travelling, on rockets or whatever. In the start of the 20th century, it was discovered that galaxies are very, very, very big. And it was the father of a friend of mine, Carl Shapley. His father was Professor Harlow Shapley, astronomer at the University of Harvard, who really was able to use telescopes to do very detailed measurements of the sky, and realised that the universe is clumped into different galaxies. And we're in one, which we call the Milky Way. We're not in the centre of it, we're on one arm of it. And it's a kind of spiral galaxy. And there are tens of thousands, indeed millions, and now we know billions, of other galaxies in the universe. And each one of them has billions and billions of stars. And around those billions and billions of stars, there are planets at different stages of evolution, because these stars are going through an evolutionary cycle, which astronomers have now mapped. They last for about 10,000 million years on average, during which there's enough time for a civilization to come into being and for human life, or something like it, to evolve, provided the planets are at a certain habitable distance around the suns. Now, astronomers have calculated, given the sheer size and scale of the universe, of all these different galaxies that Harlow discovered, we now know there are so many potentially habitable planets. It's in the tens and tens of billions, that at any one time in the entire universe, which would all the sum total of all the galaxies, there must be tens and tens of billions of sophisticated cultures and civilizations similar to those on Earth. Now that's what cosmism and ufology says. That's its starting premise. And it's a new religious movement, because up until 100 years ago this wasn't even thought of as a possibility. We thought, our ancestors thought, it's a sad thought really, that we're the only life forms in the universe. This is the only planet with any kind of life, and we're in the middle of an empty universe. But I don't think those views are tenable. At least this is what the tradition says. And there's a whole field of what's now called exobiology, as people are studying with telescopes. They're quite good at this here in France. There's official astronomers near Paris that are looking up at stars and finding other planets, and then they've got very detailed telescopes able to see what is the content of those planets. You know, are they rich in iron? Have they got oxygen? Is there any water? These are the kinds of things exobiologists are studying, which is, are there biological life forms on these other planets? They've certainly found water on quite a few of them. And where there's water, there's normally some kind of life takes shape. It's not only in the Europe, France and America that these thoughts have happened, but also in Russia. And that's very interesting, given that poor old Russia's gone down a very dark path with Putin and co. And they're bashing their poor little neighbour, Ukraine, for nothing they've done. I only wish some of the cosmists of Russian intellectual life would sort of go and call on the Kremlin and tell them to stop, because Russia has a very profound tradition intellectually, associated particularly with a man called Vernadsky. When I went to Moscow and met colleagues at the Institute of Philosophy in Moscow, which is their main think tank for philosophers, they all loved Vernadsky, who I'd never really studied in great detail, but Vernadsky was one of the inventors of the Gaia hypothesis, which is that life is diffused throughout the whole planet. We know that life isn't restricted to just humans, it's animals, plants, trees, but the whole of the biosphere could be said to be a living organism, said Vernadsky. And it's also on other planets. And this is what inspired the early exploration of rockets by Soviet scientists. They wanted to explore the universe, and they were the first nation to get Sputnik up, which was a sort of communications satellite going around the Earth. And the Russian space race was quite, profound. What people don't realise is it wasn't really about militarism. Unfortunately, the space race between America and Russia devolved into a sort of hate race. And they started building rockets that could fire and destroy each other's cities in no time at all. Nuclear weapons. Now that to me is a complete misunderstanding of what cosmism is all about. The point of exploring space is not to be able to craftily destroy your enemy, even cleverer. It's to actually explore the incredible universe. I mean, we have to crack the speed of light, otherwise we can't really leave this solar system. I mean, the journey times are too long. And scientists are working on this. I'd like to see Russian, American, Japanese, European, French, German, all the great space scientists working jointly on cracking the speed of light and devising vehicles for interplanetary and eventually intergalactic space travel. It will come, I would hope that it comes in my lifetime, but at the moment the most important thing is to make sure we don't blow up the Earth in the meantime, because it's like we've given monkeys the sort of advanced tools and they don't know what to do with them, so they're just shooting each other. You wouldn't give a whole bunch of weapons to a tribe of monkeys in the jungle. They would just start fighting and shooting, and that's sort of where we're at. Some of the cosmic thinkers I want to talk about, in the Russian tradition we have Vernadsky, we have Chizhevsky, Kolodny and Chiskovsky, all of whom helped with the Russian rocket research, but also speculated about the makeup of the universe, how big it is, what are the star cycles, and they helped do some of the primary research into the shape and size and structure of the cosmos. In the West we have other thinkers like Jacques Vallée, a French-American. He has got into the whole question of this paradox that if the universe is people with advanced intelligent beings, where are they all? This is sometimes called the Fermi paradox. If the numbers are correct and there are billions and billions of worlds with advanced intelligent beings on, how come none of them have come to tea yet? Why haven't they landed on the lawn of the White House? Why don't they stop the Ukraine war? Instead, it all seems to be very silent. That's the Fermi paradox, And there are various explanations put forward. One is there's a rule of non-intervention, that the planet is a sort of experimental base in ethics. It's a kind of philosophy club in writ large, And the teacher, although they know the answers, they're not allowed to tell the students, we have to pass this test ourselves. We have to choose to do right. This was Kant's point as an ethical teacher. We're given freedom, the possibility of doing evil, yes, but we have to shy away from that and choose to do good. I mean, it's possible for Putin and his cronies even now to choose to do good, to look at the facts, to look at the destruction and havoc they cause, to look at the problems it's causing the Russian economy and the European economy, to look at the mayhem it's causing in Africa, and to choose to do good, and to come out and say, no, this was a mistake. I'm going to retire to a monastery. Putin could announce that on television tomorrow and go and live the rest of his days on retreat in a monastery. I advocate that, Vladimir. Other people say they are contacting us, and that very high intelligences do contact humans, have done for some time. And what they do is they choose, a bit like mediums, they choose people that can tune into their wavelength of thought. So there's a whole bunch of people, channelers they often call themselves, who apparently receive messages from extraterrestrials. And I've read many books, I've seen many writings, I've watched many documentaries where people are interviewed explaining this, how they do it. And it's, this is more what's called ufology. And now, is it true? Well, my duty as a philosopher of religions is to just look at the facts, the evidence, to practice what's called the phenomenology of religions. All I can say is that many millions of people believe it is true. They've had experiences, and I've estimated there's about 500,000 people that hardcore believers in UFOs, and they know someone that's seen one, or they've even had what are called abduction experiences. Some people claim that they're out walking in the woods and suddenly a UFO appears and they're whisked off into it and taken on a tour around, flying about. And there's thousands of cases like that, which have happened. Now, I suspend judgment. I once had a very strange experience when I was on the eve of my 21st birthday. I'm sharing this in public for the first time, actually. On the eve of my 21st birthday, I was about to move to Canada. I'd been looking for God, truth, the meaning of life, and hadn't found it studying philosophy at Bristol, so I was going to go to Canada and work and, seek a new path. But I went for one retreat weekend up onto the South Downs into a very remote part of nature, surrounded by trees and downland and no people. I just thought, I'll go meditate in the woods up there and see if any messages come. Maybe I should do something else instead of going to America, or Canada actually. Anyway, during the middle of the night, I was sitting up there meditating as 20, and I saw this star, bright light, and I looked, I thought, that's a really bright light. What's that? Is that an aircraft? But it didn't behave like an all aircraft. It wasn't, you can tell when it's an aircraft, it's got little blinking lights and it goes across at a straight line, and then there's usually a rumble. No, it wasn't that at all. It didn't do that. It wasn't a helicopter. And I was looking at it, I was thinking, what are you? And then it started I could see that it was moving and it was coming towards me. And I looked at it and I thought, that's moving quite fast, whatever it is. And then as I looked, I thought, that's coming straight to me here on this exposed part of downland, 1,000 feet up in the air, surrounded by no one anywhere, in the middle of the night. And to be honest, I don't really want to be here when it lands. So I had this sort of panic attack as this thing, I stood my ground, I was sitting, I think, meditating, till it came to within what seemed like a few hundred yards, and showed no sign of stopping or anything. I have to admit, I just turned around and ran. Now, looking back, I probably wouldn't have done that, you see. I would have stayed my ground, and if it was a UFO, then so be it, I'll have a conversation. But I didn't know enough about these things then. I was a coward. Or, I don't know, it could have been a military vehicle, I don't know what it was, But I just ran and ran and ran and ran for like half an hour, and I ran all the way off the South Downs to the outskirts of Chichester. So my experience of encounters with UFOs didn't go very well. I can't, I wasn't abducted into a spacecraft and shown the mysteries of the universe. On the other hand, it's probably quite good that I wasn't, or I'd be just, another kind of person with a weird tale about UFOs. And I probably wouldn't have bothered with all my studies of philosophy. But anyway, that's my little story. There have been lots of other sages, who've written about this stuff. Paul Devereux, a friend of mine in Britain, has written about maybe the ancients who built Stonehenge, the old druids of those eras, were also in touch with cosmic intelligences. If you look back at the alignments of these kind of sacred sites, it looks like there's a divine intelligence, even a cosmic intelligence behind it. Maybe, he's been speculating like that, as have other druid friends. Another man, von Daniken, has written saying, well, maybe these divine intelligences from other planets have visited Earth at different times in our history. Maybe they've helped evolve different advanced civilizations, the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Celts, the Druids, the Greeks, maybe they've had visitations. And I have friends in Israel that are convinced that that's true, and that that's what the Bible tells us, that when the prophets are visited by fiery chariots, actually what's happening is UFOs are coming with, and that the prophetic wisdom of Israel was sort of powered up by these essentially extraterrestrials. Another great thinker in this field is Uri Geller, who I have met, who's a cosmic thinker and a man of many parts. His most famous party trick is he can bend spoons by just stroking them. I've seen him do it at a lunch we once had in Hampstead. But he's also a deep thinker in his own right, and he was involved with essentially a group of travelling mystics trying to diffuse the conflicts of the world between Israel, Palestine and other countries by contacting these divine intelligences from other planets and praying for help. Like, we humans need these divine wisdom seers to come and help us. If all the great prophets of all the religions, including Muhammad and the Baha'is and all the Hebrew prophets and Jesus and all the rest of them, and the Druids, were in touch with divine intelligences from other planets, well, surely now's the time they ought to be able to come down and help us. And so people like Uri Geller have been doing prayers to try and focus that. And I respect what they do. They're part of this tradition of cosmism and ufology. Another man called John Mack, who was professor of psychology at Harvard University. I didn't meet him, but I knew of his work at the time. When I was launching Philosophers of Peace back in the 80s, early 1980s, he was a professor of psychology at Harvard, researching the anxiety of people about the end of the world, a nuclear Armageddon happening. And people were having very bad dreams, and it's a very frightful thought to think that my entire civilization might go up in radioactive clouds. And so people were having great depressions and so on. He studied all that clinically and wrote about it. And I clocked his work at that point because I was running Philosophers of Peace and he was a psychologist for peace. So he was trying to say, look, this nuclear war thing's bad for people's mental health, which obviously it is. It'd be really much worse for their physical total health if the bombs ever go off. And that's why I think Putin and his war games in Ukraine are so irresponsible of a genuine world leader. He's like a total maverick who somehow got into power. But anyway, John Mack carried on with his research, and then he shifted gears. I noticed after a few years he was publishing now on abduction experiences. He got interested in the whole phenomenon of people claiming to have been abducted, like I nearly was, perhaps, discuss. And he was researching their stories and taking them at face value. He wasn't referring these people to a mental hospital. The normal thing, if you walked into a hospital in France or England today and said, I've just been abducted, they'd probably lock you on the padded cell. They'd regard you as bonkers, right? because it doesn't fit the established paradigm, which is what the scientific community believes, which is, no, there's only life on this planet. And if you say you've been abducted by beings from another planet, you must be crazy, by definition. Well, John Mack wasn't prepared to say that. He said, no, I'm going to listen to their stories, document what they say, I'm going to assemble all the stories, and he did like 10,000 interviews with people. I'm going to record it all, I'm going to try and fact check it. So if they say they were abducted along a certain road in Canada at a certain time of day, I'll check out, is that possible? and then I'm going to try and analyse it psychologically. What sorts of people do these experiences happen to? Is there any pattern that can be established? Does it always happen to unmarried women who are, desperately looking for a boyfriend? Could they be sexual fantasies in that case, or does it happen to, single men that are on the prowl and wanting to commit suicide? So he did psychological examinations of the groups who were having these experiences. He discovered they're pretty much normal people. There aren't any telltale factors, they're not showing the symptoms of other associated mental illness. So he came to the conclusion they're actually sane, clinically. Right. Now he published this. Don't forget he's a professor at Harvard. And the colleagues at Harvard University got very twitchy and they tried to sack him. They said, you're not allowed to say that. What are you saying, that there are alien beings and they're coming and abducting people? You're not allowed to say that, we're going to fire you. And so poor old John Mack, he stood his ground. It's a brilliant example of academic freedom in action. He said, to hell you're going to fire me, I'm a professor, I'm in a trade union, I have the right of freedom of speech, and I have the right of freedom of research. Sack me if you can. And the fellows of Harvard tried to sack him. It went to court, and he won. And it was just, he wasn't promoting the idea of alien beings coming and abducting people. He was just studying as a scientist the fact that millions of people have these experiences, and therefore isn't it worth studying? So, bless him. Unfortunately, soon after that, I wish he were alive today, I wish you could watch this film, but he was also a fan of Lawrence of Arabia, a great British military adventurer and archaeologist who helped the Arabs win World War I. And he was on his way to a Lawrence of Arabia conference near Oxford once, and he got killed in a car crash. Poor old John Mack. He's no longer with us. We need him back. But anyway, so there's another example of what's in this box. And Nick Pope is another one who's written a great book called Above Top Secret. I've met Nick Pope, heard him lecture. He was a British researcher of UFOs who was given a desk in the Ministry of the MOD, the Ministry of Defence in London, which is right next to Whitehall, Downing Street. It's a huge building. He had an office in there which was to report and research all unexplained aerial phenomena, UFOs. He was given a small team and they had to go and investigate every single report anywhere in the UK. And they happen quite often. Somebody sees strange lights in the sky. There's sort of weird explosions going on and abductions and similar things like this. And Nick Pope got on his desk, all these things would come in by fax or phone, help, we've just seen a UFO, etc. He would then get in his car or on the train and go and investigate. And he gave this brilliant lecture. He was in that job for I think 10 years. And he said that about 70% of them could be explained by rational means, like weather balloons, etc., etc., things. But he said there's a certain percentage, I think it was about 30%, that are inexplicable. They seem to be genuine extraterrestrial involvement. They can't explain it. And this is the guy in charge of the MOD's research project. Similar, and I met him, he's struck me as a man of great integrity. He's still writing about these things. We saw last week how Ron Hubbard also believed in extraterrestrials, founder of Scientology. Other kind of New Age or New Thought movements also believe in them. And we're going to look at what's called New Age a bit later, which is box 110. We won't get there tonight. So anyway, that's this one. You know, I think it's a fairly harmless. I mean, as a philosopher, of course, I want truth. So if it's true there's intelligent beings on other planets, then let's make contact. I mean, I think, you know, a certain caution might be needed, because what if they're really scary, nasty aliens that want to colonise the Earth and take over? There are people that say that. Well, in that case, we should have very good defences against them. My view as a philosopher is that the best defence against evil is truth, righteousness and goodness, and the divine power of love. I think this planet has got enough light workers to defend itself against any dark or evil forces out there, elsewhere in the cosmos. I also believe, I hope, that if a civilization is so clever that it's cracked light speed and it can travel to other worlds, it must have surely evolved morally to a place at which it's not going to misuse its powers. You know, when you're a very young child and you're just learning to walk, you like bashing into things and breaking them. A little baby coming into my museum here would just smash things and, you know, bash the camera. It doesn't know any better. It's not that it's malicious, it's testing its powers. So it'll spill the tea, knock the camera over, smash the fire. You know, before you know it, the house is going up in flames. Well, that's kind of what we're at, our level of human civilization. The Putins of this world are like babies smashing the place up. I don't think people like that, races and civilizations of that immaturity, would be granted access to the final secrets of things like extraterrestrial space travel beyond the speed of light, because the force that would be unleashed would be so dangerous. I hope, I believe, it's part of my faith, there's enough, there'd be an equivalent moral evolution before species get to that level. So that I think means that the kinds of beings that will be out there trying to contact the Earth will be good. You know, and that we won't be allowed to break through that speed of light barrier until we have evolved to a certain goodness level, which means we have to achieve world peace. We have to get a brotherhood of nations. We have to get men and women living happily and all the religions of the world living happily together before we'll be able to make contact with these other civilizations. And that's why there's a certain urgency behind the work I'm doing for peace. You know, we can either choose that way of universality and love and divine wisdom sharing, or we can go the way of, you know, the worst cruel sort of jungle law of just bashing each other, like Putin is trying to pound the poor Ukrainians into submission with his rockets, and a total misuse of you know, modern science. Okay, that's that one. Cosmism. And I'm going to finish with one more, which is an interesting one and controversial, and it's Satanism. Gosh, what's that doing in here? Right, well, Satanism is a particular faith, and it's an interesting one, and it's quite small. I reckon there's about 10,000 Satanists on the planet at the moment. And probably in the whole of history there might have been maybe 200,000. What are they called? Well, Satanists or Luciferians or Paladists or Ophites. They have different names. So who is a Satanist? What is their faith? Why is it a new religious movement? I suppose the one kind of common theme that these Satanists believe in, and I'm going to explain a bit more, is that they think the Bible story is wrong when it blames Satan for the fall of man and the giving of knowledge of good and evil to human beings. The Bible is written in a way that God is the good figure, creates man, puts us in a garden, gives us a tree we're not allowed to eat from, and then has been punishing us ever since because our ancestors, Adam and Eve, happened to eat from this tree. And therefore, all evils, all suffering, all wars, all cruelty are God's punishment on us. Now, Satanists say that's not a very nice God. Like, what? Because, any father knows that the one thing you don't say to a child when you leave the room is, don't touch that. Because the minute you're out of the room, the kid touches it. I mean, it's just human nature, curiosity. So if God's serious, if that story is at all true, and Satanists would dispute its veracity, they'd say it's a myth, right? It's sort of, the God of that myth is not a very pleasant being. He's a control freak. He doesn't want human beings to really have much in the way of intellectual adventure. You have to follow one of the kind of package faiths that the prophets allow you to follow. Whereas the Satanists say, well, actually Satan is the hero of the Bible. He's the only one that actually makes any sense, because he is defying God's over-judgmental, super-ego kind of, I'm in charge, you can only do what I say type of attitude. Now, so Satanists on the whole would say, no, we're standing with the rebels of history. And there's a whole interesting bunch of them. Goethe, in a sense, in Faust, makes out Satan to be not quite the bogeyman that he ought to be. Goethe, as a Freemason and a member of the Illuminati, he was part of an 18th century sort of pro-Satan shift of public opinion, which coincided with the Enlightenment. At the same time, just a bit before Goethe, you had Benjamin Franklin, the founder of the USA, who was a friend with the founder of the Hellfire Club in England, Francis Dashwood, who had some caves built near his country house in West Wickham in England. And they used to have meetings of the Hellfire Club. They were Satanists essentially, but what did they do there? Well, they just got drunk and made love and lit candles to the ancient gods. Is that so naughty? I don't believe they ever did anything like human sacrifice or anything really naughty. They just were voluptuaries. And Dashwood and Benjamin Franklin were great friends. And it's interesting that in the American Constitution it says that we human beings have the right to pursue happiness. It's one of the things guaranteed by the state. Well, I agree with that. And so would the Satanists, you see. They would say that no, we're put on this earth not to be punished, not to suffer guilt, not to have horrible things done to us, not to be racially abused or made slaves or sexually abused or anything like that. We're supposed to be free beings living in a free world with human rights, and the most important is the right to happiness. And so, it's interesting that when the Spanish Armada tried to conquer Britain, they had about 400 ships came to attack us, and the little fleet led by Sir Francis Drake and others managed to fight them off with help from storms. This had happened in Holland, the Dutch-Spanish wars as well. And the Spanish couldn't figure out how it had happened. And they blamed Sir Walter Raleigh, who led the Armada along with Sir Francis Drake. They called him the Great Lucifer, because Sir Walter Raleigh was a very clever, not just a sailor and explorer, but also an intellectual and a student of Dr. John Dee, who was the Anglican kind of magus at the court of Queen Elizabeth. These people were they Satanists? The Spanish Catholic conquistadors said they were Satanists, right? And they had on their ships torture equipment. If they'd have landed in London and got there, they would have put all these people to the rack as heretics, right? Including Dee and Raleigh and Drake and all the rest of them. I think they were just rebels seeking independence of mind and independence of thought. And that sort of surfaced again in the 18th century, and people like Goethe and the Freemasons were doing the